Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the divine masculine does not awaken when he becomes stronger, but when he finally breaks? What if the collapse he fears, the silence he cannot explain, the heartbreak he cannot control, and the version of himself that no longer works, are not signs that he is losing himself, but signs that his soul is trying to set him free? Because real awakening rarely begins with peace. It begins with pressure, with confusion, with loss, with the painful moment when the old identity can no longer carry the man he is becoming. So why does the divine masculine so often break before he awakens? And what if that breaking is not the end of his power, but the beginning of his truth? In this video, we will uncover the deeper spiritual reason why the divine masculine breaks before he awakens, and why the very thing that looks like collapse may actually be sacred transformation in disguise. Chapter 1. The Great Misunderstanding about Masculine Awakening. There is a great misunderstanding at the center of the divine masculine journey. Most people think awakening looks beautiful in the beginning. They imagine it arrives like light, like sudden wisdom, like emotional clarity, like spiritual peace descending on a man until he finally becomes calm, conscious, and aligned. They imagine awakening as a rising. But for many men, real awakening first looks like a falling. It looks like confusion, like silence, like emotional disruption, like restlessness that cannot be explained, like a life that still appears functional on the outside while something inside begins to crack. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because when people do not understand the true nature of masculine awakening, they misread the first stage of transformation. They think the man is simply lost, regressing, breaking down for no reason. They think something has gone wrong because he no longer seems stable in the old way, because the old identity is trembling, because what once made him feel strong no longer fits. But what if that shaking is not failure? What if it is initiation? What if the very thing that looks like collapse is the first honest moment of his life? This is the truth most people are not taught. The divine masculine does not usually awaken when he feels most powerful. He awakens when the version of power he trusted begins to fail him. That is the beginning. Not peace. Not perfection. Not immediate spiritual mastery. Disillusionment. Because before a man can awaken into what is true, he often has to become disillusioned with what is false. And false masculinity can survive for a very long time. It can survive through achievement, through emotional control, through silence, through being admired, through being needed, through appearing composed, through keeping life organized enough that no one notices how disconnected he really feels inside. This is why many men do not look broken until the soul can no longer tolerate the performance. That sentence matters. A man can function for years from a place that is not fully real. He can build routines, relationships, responsibilities, and identities around a version of himself that is more survival than truth. He can become highly skilled at appearing strong while remaining inwardly split. He can become reliable, disciplined, respected, even impressive. But none of that guarantees awakening. Sometimes it delays it. Because as long as the old structure still works well enough, he may never question whether it is aligned. As long as the image still holds, as long as the role still brings him value, as long as the distraction still numbs the ache, he may keep living from a self that is functional but not fully alive. That is why awakening so often begins through discomfort. Not because life is cruel, because the false self rarely surrenders when it is comfortable. The ego clings to what is familiar, even if the familiar is empty, even if the familiar is costly, even if the familiar is keeping the soul in exile. So life begins pressing, sometimes gently at first. A strange dissatisfaction, a sense that success no longer tastes the same, a growing emotional heaviness, a silence that starts following him, a connection that touches him more deeply than he expected, a feeling he can no longer explain away. Then, if he still refuses to listen, the pressure deepens. A heartbreak, a collapse, a loss of certainty, an identity crisis, a season where everything that once made him feel stable suddenly feels fragile. This is the part most people misread. They think awakening begins when a man becomes more polished. But often, it begins when he becomes unable to polish the fracture any longer. He cannot keep pretending the old version of him still works. He cannot keep hiding behind routine. He cannot keep using control as proof of strength. He cannot keep calling numbness peace. He cannot keep convincing himself that the life he built is enough if his soul feels absent inside it. This is why the beginning of awakening can look so unspiritual. A man may become more withdrawn, more conflicted, more emotional in private, more restless, less interested in the things that used to distract him, less convinced by the identity he once defended. From the outside, it may look like he is getting weaker, but inwardly he may be getting more honest. And honesty is where awakening truly begins. Because awakening is not first a spiritual performance. It is a confrontation with truth. Truth about what no longer fits. Truth about what hurts. Truth about what has been buried. Truth about the difference between the life he is living and the life his soul can actually inhabit. This confrontation is painful. It shakes the masculine ego at its root. Because many men have been conditioned to believe that strength means staying composed, staying useful, staying focused, staying above emotional complication, staying in control no matter what. They are rarely taught that real strength may require breaking with the very image they spent years building. So when the breaking comes, they interpret it as failure. They think, I am losing myself. But often the deeper truth is, I can no longer keep living as someone false. That is a very different sentence. And it changes the meaning of the whole journey. Because if the old self is built on defense, then the shaking of that self is not the destruction of the man. It is the exposure of what is not truly him. That is why the early stage of awakening feels like contradiction. One part of him still wants the old identity. It knows how to survive there. It knows the role. It knows the language. It knows the habits that keep life moving. But another part of him is beginning to suffocate under that same identity. He feels the emptiness now. He feels the weight of performing. He feels the cost of emotional exile. He feels the difference between being admired and being known. He feels the difference between being in control and being at peace. That difference becomes unbearable once the soul starts waking up. And that is the great misunderstanding. People think awakening means a man becomes instantly luminous. But many times he first becomes unable to tolerate the lie. That intolerance creates pressure. That pressure creates fracture. That fracture creates exposure. And exposure creates the possibility of truth. This is why the divine masculine often looks like he is breaking before he looks like he is awakening. Because the breaking is not separate from the awakening. It is the doorway to it. The false self breaks. The defended identity breaks. The emotional armor begins to crack. The old certainty starts falling apart. The version of masculinity built on control starts trembling. And only then can something deeper begin to rise. Something quieter. More grounded. More human. More real. But to get there, he must first pass through the stage most people fear. The undoing. Not because undoing is the final destination, but because it is often the first clearing. Imagine a house built over many years, carefully arranged, structurally impressive, admired from the outside. But beneath the surface, the foundation is cracked. As long as the weather is calm, the house appears fine. Yet eventually pressure comes. The ground shifts. The walls begin to strain. And what follows may look like damage, but in truth it is revelation. The storm did not create the weakness. It exposed it. This is how awakening often works in the masculine journey. Life exposes the weak foundations, not to humiliate the man, but to show him what can no longer carry his becoming. And when that exposure begins, he may feel ashamed, confused, unsteady, less certain of who he is, less able to play the old role with conviction. That is not a sign that nothing sacred is happening. It may be a sign that something sacred has already begun. Because sacred transformation rarely starts with applause. It often starts with disillusionment. Disillusionment with the image, with the performance, with the coping mechanism, with the old strategies that once helped him survive, but now keep him separated from truth. This disillusionment is a gift, even when it hurts. Without it, he would keep worshiping the old self. Without it, he would keep calling survival strength. Without it, he would keep protecting the very identity that is preventing his soul from coming fully alive. So yes, there is a great misunderstanding about masculine awakening. People expect beauty first, but often beauty comes later. First comes the cracking, the questioning, the loss of appetite for what once distracted him, the emotional surfacing, the collapse of certainty, the terrifying sense that he no longer fits inside the version of himself he once trusted. This is not always the end of his strength. It may be the end of false strength. And false strength must die if real strength is to be born. That is why the divine masculine does not awaken by becoming instantly untouched. He awakens by becoming unable to keep pretending he is untouched. He awakens when denial becomes too expensive, when the old identity becomes too heavy, when silence becomes louder than distraction, when the fracture becomes more honest than the image. That is the first threshold. Not spiritual perfection, not immediate wisdom, a holy disruption. A moment when life no longer lets him sleep inside the costume of who he has been. And if he stays with that disruption, if he does not rush too quickly to rebuild the same mask with better language, then something profound becomes possible. The real man begins to emerge. Not the performance, not the armor, not the identity built to survive. The man beneath it. The man who does not need to appear whole, because he is learning how to become whole. The man who does not need to call numbness peace anymore. The man who does not need to worship control as his only path to safety. The man who can finally begin telling the truth about what hurts, what is empty, and what kind of life no longer fits. That is where awakening starts. Not in the fantasy, in the fracture, not in looking spiritual, in becoming honest. And once honesty enters deeply enough, the breaking is no longer meaningless. It becomes the first sacred language of transformation. Chapter 2. Why the divine masculine builds himself around control. Before the divine masculine breaks, he usually builds. He builds an identity. He builds discipline. He builds a reputation. He builds emotional walls. He builds routines, roles, patterns, and ways of moving through life that make him appear stable, strong, and in control. And for a while this works. It helps him survive. It helps him navigate pressure. It helps him function in a world that often rewards masculine composure far more than masculine truth. But what most people do not see is this. Much of what the divine masculine builds before awakening is not built from freedom. It is built from protection. That is the deeper issue. Because control does not become central in a man's life for no reason. He does not usually wake up one day and decide to live disconnected from his own heart. He adapts. He learns. He responds to pain, pressure, expectations, and unspoken rules about what it means to be a man. He learns early that strength is rewarded. Need is dangerous. Emotion must be managed. Vulnerability can be costly. Uncertainty should be hidden. Pain should be carried quietly. Confusion should not be shown. And if he wants respect, safety, or worth, he must become the man who keeps it together. So he builds around that lesson. He builds around performance, around reliability, around restraint, around image, around achievement, around emotional control. And over time, this structure becomes so normal that he mistakes it for identity. He does not just control things. He becomes the man who believes control is what makes him worthy. That belief runs deep, because control gives him something essential in the early stages of life: predictability, distance from pain, a sense of strength, a way to avoid the helplessness he once felt, a way to stay ahead of exposure, a way to keep his softer parts hidden behind something more acceptable. So yes, control can look impressive. It can look like discipline, like focus, like leadership, like stoicism, like self-respect, like standards. And sometimes it contains pieces of those things. But awakening eventually reveals that much of his control was never as pure as he thought. Some of it was fear with better posture. Some of it was survival disguised as strength. Some of it was emotional self-protection made to look like masculine maturity. That is why Chapter 2 matters. Because if we do not understand why the divine masculine builds himself around control, we will misread his breaking later. We will think he is simply weak when the structure begins collapsing, without realizing how much of his entire identity was organized around not feeling weak in the first place. The control was never random. It was architecture, an inner architecture built to protect him from pain, shame, vulnerability, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. He builds it through silence, through routine, through staying busy, through being needed, through achieving, through not saying too much, through acting unaffected, through learning how to carry his wounds in ways that do not make other people uncomfortable. And because the world often rewards this version of masculinity, he gets reinforced. People trust the composed man, admire the focused man, respect the disciplined man, depend on the man who never seems to fall apart. So he receives a powerful message. Keep being this. Keep being the one who handles it. Keep being the one who stays strong. Keep being the one who does not need much. Keep being the one who never becomes too emotional, too soft, too uncertain, too complicated. Over time, that message becomes a prison. Because now he is not simply living. He is maintaining the image, maintaining the role, maintaining the version of strength that others recognize, even if it keeps him far from who he actually is. This is where many divine masculines become deeply split. Outwardly, they may look capable. Inwardly, they may feel exhausted. Outwardly, they may appear independent. Inwardly, they may feel profoundly unseen. Outwardly, they may look calm. Inwardly, they may be carrying tremendous tension. Outwardly, they may seem strong. Inwardly, they may be terrified of what happens if the structure ever cracks. That fear is central. Because once control becomes identity, losing control feels like losing self. This is why the breaking phase is so intense later on. It is not just that life becomes painful. It is that the very system he trusted to survive begins failing him. And when that happens, it threatens the entire version of masculinity he has built his life around. But before we get there, we need to understand the original wound. Why did control become so necessary? often because it offered protection from helplessness. A boy who feels too much but has nowhere safe to put it may learn to lock it down. A young man who gets hurt in love may learn to stay guarded. A man who feels pressure to succeed may learn to derive worth from performance. A soul that feels uncertain in a chaotic world may learn to cling to structure, as if structure can save him. None of this makes him bad. It makes him adaptive. But adaptation is not the same as awakening. An adaptive masculinity may survive. It may achieve. It may impress. It may even look admirable from the outside. But it is still often disconnected from the deeper soul. Because survival-based control can only take a man so far. It can help him build a life. But it cannot help him inhabit it. That sentence is important. A man can build a life he does not know how to fully live inside. He can create success without peace, discipline without tenderness, presence without intimacy, order without inner freedom, strength without softness, control without love. And when this happens long enough, something inside begins drying out. Not always dramatically at first. Sometimes quietly. He becomes less moved, less nourished, less able to feel joy in what once motivated him, less interested in what used to distract him, less convinced by the old image, less able to ignore the inner emptiness that control never truly healed. This is why the divine masculine builds himself around control before he breaks. Because control was the bridge between his pain and his performance. It allowed him to carry unresolved things without directly touching them. It allowed him to keep moving without fully grieving. It allowed him to feel powerful without becoming vulnerable. It allowed him to shape the outside world when the inside world felt less safe to enter. But over time, control begins costing him. It costs spontaneity. It costs real emotional honesty. It costs softness with self. It costs trust in the unfolding of life. It costs connection, because true connection cannot fully bloom where control dominates every vulnerable space. And most painfully, it costs surrender. Surrender is terrifying to the control-built masculine because surrender feels like the death of the whole structure. If control is how he learned to stay safe, then surrender feels like danger. If control is how he earned worth, then surrender feels like losing worth. If control is how he managed pain, then surrender feels like being flooded by everything he has held back. That is why many men resist awakening at first. Not because they do not want truth, but because truth threatens the structure that kept them functioning. The divine masculine builds himself around control because control helped him survive a world that did not always teach him how to be emotionally whole. It taught him how to be useful, how to be strong, how to be admirable, how to be composed, but not always how to be real. So he builds the false self carefully, brick by brick, habit by habit, roll by roll. The achiever, the protector, the stoic one, the leader, the dependable one, the one who stays calm, the one who does not need much, the one who keeps his inner life private and his outer life efficient. And because this identity can appear noble, he may never question it until something forces the question. That is the key. He usually does not dismantle this on his own. Life has to challenge it. Love has to expose it. Loss has to shake it. Silence has to confront it. Disillusionment has to make it feel empty. Only then does he begin asking, why do I need control so much? Why does uncertainty affect me so deeply? Why do I feel strong when I am in charge, but unstable when I have to surrender? Why do I keep protecting the image even when the image is exhausting me? Why do I keep calling control maturity when part of me knows it is fear? These questions are the beginning of awakening. But before awakening begins, the architecture of control must be seen clearly. Because once a man sees that much of his masculinity was built to avoid helplessness rather than to embody truth, something profound happens. He stops romanticizing the structure. He starts seeing the cost. He sees how much energy goes into maintaining composure, how much tension lives beneath the appearance of calm, how often he uses certainty to avoid intimacy, how much of his identity depends on not being seen in his unfinished places, how difficult it has become to truly rest because the controlling self never fully relaxes. This realization is humbling, but it is also sacred, because humility is what begins loosening the old architecture. Now he can admit that control did serve him once. It protected him, helped him, stabilized him, got him through seasons he may not have survived otherwise. But now, the same structure that once protected him is keeping him from becoming. That is the deeper tragedy. What saved him in one season becomes the cage in another. And unless life interrupts it, he may keep calling the cage strength forever. That is why the divine masculine often has to break before he awakens. Because the control-built self does not surrender just because it hears beautiful spiritual ideas. It surrenders when the cost of maintaining itself becomes too great, when the image no longer comforts, when the routine no longer numbs, when the success no longer satisfies, when the heart begins asking questions the structure cannot answer. Then the real journey starts. Then he begins realizing that the man he built is not necessarily the man he is. That the control he trusted is not the same as peace. That the composure he mastered is not the same as wholeness. That the strength he performed is not the same as embodied masculine truth. And this realization does not destroy him. It prepares him. Because what is being questioned is not his soul. It is the architecture around it. And once that architecture begins cracking, the man beneath the control has a chance to finally emerge. That is chapter 2. The divine masculine builds himself around control because control became his language of survival. But survival can only imitate peace for so long. Eventually, life asks for something deeper. Not better management, not stronger performance. Truth. And truth is what will begin dismantling everything he built to avoid becoming truly known, even by himself. Chapter 3. The hidden pressure of living behind the mask. There is a kind of pressure many divine masculines carry that almost no one sees. It is not always visible in his words, not always obvious in his schedule, not always written on his face. Because the deepest pressure is often hidden behind the mask. And the mask can look impressive. It can look like composure, like discipline, like strength, like confidence, like leadership, like calm under pressure, like the man who always knows what to do, always keeps moving, always finds a way to stay in control. But beneath that appearance, there is often a heavy and silent burden. The burden of maintaining an identity that no longer feels fully true. This is one of the least understood parts of the divine masculine journey. People often focus on the moment he breaks, the moment he withdraws, the moment he changes, the moment he starts awakening. But fewer people ask what came before that collapse. Fewer people ask how much pressure it took to keep the old version of him standing for so long. Because before he breaks outwardly, he has often been straining inwardly for a very long time. He has been carrying the pressure to stay strong, the pressure to stay composed, the pressure to be useful, the pressure to be respected, the pressure to not look lost, the pressure to not feel too much, the pressure to keep moving, keep handling, keep performing. Even when something deeper inside him is tired, confused, lonely, or quietly starving for truth. This is what living behind the mask feels like. It is not just pretending. It is labor. Emotional labor. Spiritual labor. Identity labor. The labor of constantly managing how he is seen, so he does not have to reveal how divided he may actually feel. And that labor is exhausting, because every mask demands maintenance. The strong one must keep acting strong. The composed one must keep acting composed. The detached one must keep acting like he needs nothing. The achiever must keep achieving. The protector must keep protecting. The man who is admired for staying stable must never let the cracks show too clearly. So even when he is tired, he keeps going. Even when he is hurting, he keeps functioning. Even when he is confused, he keeps performing certainty. Even when his soul feels dry, he keeps feeding the image that once made him feel valuable. This is the hidden pressure. Not simply pain. Pressure to hide the pain well. And that kind of pressure changes a man. It can make him quieter, but not peaceful. It can make him focused, but not fulfilled. It can make him admired, but not known. It can make him look powerful, while secretly feeling like he is living farther and farther away from his own center. That distance matters. Because one of the cruelest things about the mask is that it can bring a man success without bringing him home to himself. He can win and still feel empty. He can lead and still feel disconnected. He can be desired and still feel unseen. He can stay in control and still feel inwardly unstable the moment life stops cooperating. This is why the pressure becomes so intense over time. Because the more he lives from the mask, the more he must protect the mask. And the more he protects the mask, the less room he has to breathe as a real human being. He cannot fully soften, cannot fully rest, cannot fully admit what is not working, cannot fully tell the truth about the ache beneath the performance. Why? Because the mask was not built only to impress others. It was built to protect him from exposure. If the world sees the fracture, then maybe the world sees where he is unfinished. If love sees the fear, then maybe love can wound him. If silence becomes too deep, then maybe all the emotions he kept buried will rise. If he stops performing, then maybe he will have to meet the part of himself that no longer knows who he is without the role. So he keeps the mask alive. Not always consciously. Not always strategically. Sometimes simply because he does not know another way yet. This is what makes the pressure so tragic. Much of it is invisible even to him. He may think he is just tired, just stressed, just overworked, just emotionally private, just focused on other things. But deeper down, the pressure is often spiritual. It is the pressure of carrying an identity that once helped him survive, but now keeps him separated from his own truth. Imagine wearing armor every single day for so long that you forget what your real skin feels like. At first, the armor protects you. It makes you feel safe. It helps you face battle. It gives you shape and structure. But after enough time, the armor becomes heavy. It rubs against the body. It limits movement. It traps heat. It makes tenderness impossible. It keeps intimacy at a distance. And if you wear it long enough, you may forget that it was ever meant to come off. That is what happens to many divine masculines. The mask stops feeling like something they use. It starts feeling like who they are. And once that happens, every crack in the mask feels terrifying. Because now he is not just losing a coping mechanism. He feels like he is losing himself. This is why the hidden pressure can become unbearable. He is carrying not only his pain, but the requirement to appear above it. Not only his uncertainty, but the demand to project certainty. Not only his longing, but the pressure to act unaffected. Not only his emotional hunger, but the image of being the one who needs nothing. And over time, this creates inner tension that cannot be sustained forever. Something begins to strain. He may notice that the things he used to enjoy no longer satisfy him. That the routines that once stabilized him now feel mechanical. That the success he chased does not touch the deeper emptiness. that the versions of connection built on surface attraction or control no longer feed his soul. That even when life looks full, something inside still feels profoundly unfilled. This is the cost of the mask. It can help him survive the world, but it cannot help him feel alive within it. That is a devastating realization for a man who has built his entire identity around staying functional. Because now he must face a terrifying question. What if the very thing that made me look strong is the thing keeping me far from who I really am? That question does not arrive lightly. It usually comes after years of tension, years of carrying, years of suppressing, years of being what was needed instead of what was true, years of maintaining a masculine image that earned him safety but did not necessarily give him peace. This is why the divine masculine often looks stable right before he breaks. Not because he is actually stable, but because he has become highly trained in carrying instability without showing it. That distinction matters. The outer life may still appear intact. The responsibilities may still be handled. The conversations may still sound composed. The routines may still be in place. But inwardly, the pressure is building. The grief he never processed is still there. The loneliness he never named is still there. The longing he never admitted is still there. The exhaustion of pretending is still there. The fear of being seen without the mask is still there. And eventually, the soul can no longer bear the weight of this divided existence. That is when life begins pressing harder. Not to punish him, to expose the unsustainable structure. Because the hidden pressure of living behind the mask is not meant to be permanent. It is often the very tension that prepares the collapse. And collapse, as painful as it is, can be mercy. Because once a man can no longer maintain the mask without feeling the cost, he is finally close to truth. Now the old identity starts trembling. Now the exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. Now the image no longer fully comforts him. Now the inner ache begins speaking louder than the outer performance. This is where many men mistake themselves for broken. But often, they are simply reaching the end of what false strength can carry. And false strength always has a limit. It can carry a man through seasons, through ambition, through heartbreak, through pressure, through public success, through private emptiness. But it cannot carry him all the way into awakening. Because awakening asks for something the mask can never give. Honesty, tenderness, surrender, contact with what is real, the courage to stop performing and start feeling, the willingness to admit that the version of strength he mastered has become too expensive to maintain. This is why the pressure behind the mask becomes sacred, even though it hurts. It is the pressure that reveals the lie. The pressure that cracks the costume. The pressure that makes the soul say enough. The pressure that slowly forces him to recognize that survival and truth are not the same thing. And once he sees that, he cannot unsee it. He begins noticing how much effort goes into appearing fine. How much tension lives beneath his calm. How much sadness hides beneath his self-control. How much fear hides beneath his distance. How much longing hides beneath his silence. This awareness is painful, but it is also the first real opening. Because the man who begins to feel the hidden pressure is the man who is getting closer to the hidden truth. The truth that he is tired. The truth that he is carrying too much alone. The truth that the old identity is no longer enough. The truth that being admired is not the same as being met. The truth that control has not given him the peace he hoped for. The truth that his soul wants more than performance can provide. And that truth, once felt deeply enough, begins changing everything. So when we ask why the divine masculine breaks before he awakens, we must understand this chapter. He breaks because the pressure of living behind the mask becomes too great. Too great to keep pretending. Too great to keep carrying. Too great to keep calling it strength when it is slowly starving him from the inside. The breaking does not come from nowhere. It comes from years of tension seeking release, years of falseness seeking exposure, years of inward division asking for resolution. This is why the breaking is not random. It is often the body, the heart, and the soul finally refusing to keep paying the price of the mask. And when that refusal begins, something sacred is already happening. The false stability is weakening. The hidden truth is rising. The man beneath the role is beginning to breathe again. That is chapter 3. The hidden pressure of living behind the mask is what makes the breaking inevitable. Because no man can live forever behind an identity that earns him survival while costing him his soul. Sooner or later, the pressure becomes revelation. And revelation is where the real awakening begins. Chapter 4. Why life has to break what the ego refuses to surrender. There comes a point in the divine masculine journey where life stops asking gently. Not because life is cruel. Not because the man is cursed. Not because pain is random. But because the ego rarely surrenders what still appears to work. That is the hard truth. As long as the old identity keeps producing enough reward, enough validation, enough structure, enough movement, enough distraction, the ego will keep defending it. Even if the soul is starving, even if the man is emotionally exhausted, even if his relationships feel shallow, his victories feel empty, and his inner world feels increasingly disconnected from the life he presents outside. The ego does not measure by truth. It measures by function. If the mask still functions, it keeps the mask. If control still organizes the world, it clings tighter. If performance still earns respect, it doubles down. If distance still protects him from vulnerability, it calls distance wisdom. If silence still hides confusion, it names silence strength. This is why life eventually has to intervene. Because some men would never willingly release what has become central to their identity, even when that identity is slowly imprisoning them. The divine masculine often does not break because he is weak. He breaks because life must pry open what the ego would protect forever. This is where many people misunderstand suffering. They see heartbreak, separation, loss, failure, collapse, silence, or emotional unraveling. And they assume these are merely unfortunate events. They assume something went wrong. They assume life is punishing him, or that he has somehow lost his path. But sometimes the deeper truth is this. Life is breaking what he would never surrender on his own. That changes the whole meaning of the experience. Because if a man is deeply attached to a false version of strength, he will not let it go simply because someone tells him there is a better way. If he has built his identity around control, he will not abandon control because surrender sounds beautiful in theory. If he has been rewarded for emotional distance, he will not risk tenderness until distance itself becomes unbearable. The ego does not bow to truth easily. It bargains. It resists. It rationalizes. It postpones. It says just a little longer. Just one more achievement. Just one more distraction. Just one more season of keeping it together. Just one more version of the old self with slightly better language. That is why life often becomes more forceful. Not to destroy the man. To expose what cannot come with him into awakening. Heartbreak does this. Failure does this. Silence does this. Loss does this. A soul-level connection that unsettles his entire structure does this. Even success can do this, when it finally reveals its inability to fill what the soul has been starving for. These experiences are not always the awakening itself, but they are often the breaking point that makes awakening possible. Because something must crack before truth can enter deeply. And what cracks first is usually not the soul. It is the structure protecting the soul from being felt. The structure of control. The structure of image. The structure of emotional suppression. The the structure of constant movement, the structure of performative masculinity, the structure of I am fine when he is anything but fine. This is what life begins to break. Not his essence, his defenses. And that is why the experience feels so painful. Because the ego cannot always tell the difference between losing a defense and losing the self. To the ego, the collapse of control feels like annihilation. The loss of certainty feels like death. The failure of the old mask feels like humiliation. The inability to keep performing strength feels unbearable. But from the soul's perspective, something else is happening. A prison is opening. A false altar is being overturned. An old god is losing power. And that old god is often control. Because the divine masculine frequently places his faith in the very things that allow him to avoid helplessness. Control tells him he is safe. Performance tells him he is worthy. Distance tells him he is protected. Success tells him he is enough. Composure tells him he is strong. But life eventually asks a harder question. Are you actually free? Not admired. Not functioning. Not coping. Free. Free to tell the truth. Free to feel without collapsing. Free to love without hiding. Free to stop performing. Free to let the old identity die. Free to become a man whose strength is not built on constant self-protection. And if the answer is no, life starts dismantling the structures that keep him enslaved. This dismantling is not gentle in the way the ego prefers. It may come through the loss of a relationship that exposed his heart. It may come through separation that forces him into silence. It may come through a failure that strips away his confidence. It may come through emotional burnout that no amount of discipline can fix. It may come through a deep mirror connection that makes the old self unbearable to maintain. Whatever form it takes, the pattern is the same. Life breaks what he will not surrender. Because sometimes surrender does not come through wisdom first. It comes through the exhaustion of resistance. A man tries to hold it together until he cannot. Tries to control the outcome until it slips. Tries to preserve the image until the image no longer comforts him. Tries to stay distant until distance itself becomes painful. Tries to keep functioning in the old way until functioning no longer feels like living. That is the breaking. And that breaking is often holy. Not because pain is automatically sacred, but because pain becomes sacred when it breaks the lie that kept the soul hidden. Think of a clenched fist. As long as it stays closed, nothing can be received. Nothing can pass through. Nothing new can enter. The fist may feel strong because it is tight, but it is not open. Now imagine life forcing the hand open. At first, it feels violent, unwanted, exposing. The old tension cannot be maintained. The grip fails. But what if that opening, painful as it is the only way he can finally receive what truth has been trying to give him? That is what breaking often is. Forced openness. Not chosen by the ego, required by the soul. This is why the divine masculine so often resists awakening until life removes the illusion that resistance is working. He may keep calling control responsibility. Keep calling emotional exile maturity. Keep calling overwork purpose. Keep calling the mask manhood. So life begins separating him from the rewards of those things. It empties them, shakes them, exposes them, makes them feel hollow enough that he can no longer fully worship them. This is mercy, though it rarely feels like mercy at first. Because mercy does not always come as comfort. Sometimes mercy comes as interruption, as collapse, as losing what you thought you needed, as watching the old structure fail so clearly that denial becomes impossible. This is why breaking is often the first honest moment. The man can no longer pretend, can no longer keep the old story intact, can no longer say, I am fine and believe himself, can no longer hide from the fact that something fundamental is not working. That honesty is the beginning of surrender. Not because he has become enlightened, but because resistance has finally lost some of its power. He begins admitting, I cannot keep living like this. I cannot keep forcing what no longer aligns. I cannot keep protecting an image that is draining my life. I cannot keep calling fear strength. I cannot keep living from a structure that keeps me functional but far from truth. This is where awakening becomes possible. Not when he feels good, when he becomes honest. And honesty requires the breaking of illusion. That is why life has to break what the ego refuses to surrender. Because as long as illusion remains comfortable, it remains defended. As long as false strength remains rewarding, it remains worshipped. As long as the old self still seems useful, it remains in charge. So life removes the comfort. Not to punish him, to free him. The relationship that once stabilized him ends. The success that once fed him feels empty. The distractions stop numbing. The silence grows loud. The image begins collapsing under its own weight. And suddenly he is face to face with himself. No performance. No applause. No borrowed certainty. No easy escape from the deeper questions. Who am I without the role? Who am I when I cannot control the outcome? Who am I when the old self no longer works? Who am I beneath the mask, beneath the armor, beneath the version of masculinity I have spent my whole life defending? These questions are terrifying, but they are also sacred, because the ego hears them as a threat. The soul hears them as an invitation to stop surviving and start becoming. An invitation to stop maintaining what is false and start surrendering to what is real. An invitation to let life strip away the identities that cannot carry him into his next chapter. This is why breaking is not a mistake in the masculine path. It is often the turning point. The moment where the old self no longer has enough power to block what the deeper self is trying to become. And yes, he may fight it. He may cling. He may cycle between insight and avoidance. He may try to rebuild the same identity in a more spiritual form. But once life has broken the old illusion deeply enough, nothing feels the same again. He knows now. He knows the old structure cannot truly save him. He knows performance cannot become peace. He knows control cannot become freedom. He knows the image cannot substitute for a soul he can actually live inside. This knowing changes him. It may not make him graceful immediately, but it makes him reachable by truth. And that is enough for awakening to begin. So if life is breaking something in the divine masculine, do not always assume it is destroying him. It may be dismantling what he could never have surrendered voluntarily. It may be removing the false strength he mistook for identity. It may be exposing the masks that once protected him, but now block his growth. It may be emptying the old altar, so the real man can finally come forward. That is chapter 4. Life has to break what the ego refuses to surrender, because the ego clings to what feels familiar, even when it is imprisoning the soul. The breaking is painful because it touches identity. But beneath the pain is mercy. Beneath the collapse is revelation. Beneath the loss of false strength is the first real chance for true strength to be born. Chapter 5. Breakage is often the first honest moment of his life. There is a moment in the divine masculine journey when the performance no longer works. Not because he suddenly loses all strength. Not because he becomes less intelligent, less capable, or less disciplined. But because the old structure can no longer hide the truth from him. And when that happens, something sacred begins. He breaks. Not always publicly. Not always dramatically. Not always in a way others would understand. Sometimes he breaks in silence. Sometimes in sleepless nights. Sometimes in the space after loss. sometimes in the aftermath of a connection that touched him too deeply to dismiss, sometimes in a season where everything still looks functional, but inwardly he knows he cannot keep carrying the same version of himself. This is why breakage is so misunderstood. People think breaking is the end, the failure, the collapse that proves something has gone wrong. But for many divine masculines, breakage is the first honest moment of their life. Because before that moment, he may have been surviving through adaptation, through control, through emotional restraint, through being the version of himself that others could trust, admire, depend on, or desire. And again, none of that is meaningless. It may have helped him survive. It may have helped him build. It may have helped him become functional in a world that often rewards performance more than inner truth. But function is not the same as honesty. A man can function while still hiding from himself. He can lead while still feeling inwardly divided. He can achieve while still being disconnected from his own heart. He can appear stable while privately feeling the quiet strain of carrying a life that no longer feels true. That is why breakage matters. Because there comes a point when denial becomes too expensive. Too expensive to keep pretending. Too expensive to keep saying, "I'm fine," when the soul is exhausted. Too expensive to keep worshiping control when control is no longer bringing peace. Too expensive to keep hiding behind the mask when the mask itself has become unbearable to wear. This is the holy threshold. The moment when a man can no longer lie to himself without feeling the lie in his body. That is a very different kind of pain. It is not just heartbreak, not just disappointment, not just confusion. It is the pain of self-recognition. The pain of seeing that the old version of him is no longer enough. The pain of realizing that much of what he called strength was actually defense. The pain of knowing that what once protected him is now separating him from truth. The pain of sensing that he cannot go back, but does not yet know how to go forward. This is breakage in its deepest form. And yes, it can look messy. He may withdraw. He may feel emotionally flooded. He may become quieter, more reflective, less interested in the things that used to distract him. He may question everything. He may feel shame over what he avoided, grief over what he lost, longing for what he never fully let himself receive. But beneath all of that, something profound is happening. For perhaps the first time in his life, he is not just managing appearances. He is meeting truth. This is why breakage is often the first honest moment. Because before this, he may have had flashes of honesty, moments of reflection, private realizations, brief encounters with his own contradiction. But breakage turns those flashes into something unavoidable. Now he cannot unsee it, cannot unfeel it, cannot keep calling the old life enough, cannot keep using the same distractions with the same innocence, cannot keep pretending that what is collapsing was ever truly whole. This is the difference between discomfort and honest breakage. Discomfort can be ignored. Honest breakage cannot. It reaches deeper. It touches identity. It exposes the exact place where survival and truth have parted ways. And when that happens, the divine masculine stands in a place most people fear. The place where he no longer knows how to keep being who he has been. That uncertainty is terrifying. Because if a man has built his sense of self around being composed, useful, admired, strong, needed, capable, and in control, then breaking feels like the loss of his entire inner map. He may ask, who am I without this image? Who am I if I stop performing strength? Who am I if I admit I am not okay? Who am I if the life I built no longer feels like home? Who am I if my silence was not wisdom, but fear? Who am I if my control was never peace? Who am I if the version of masculinity I trusted has led me this far, but cannot lead me any further? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs that truth has entered deeply enough to dismantle illusion. An illusion must be dismantled if awakening is to become real. That is why breakage is sacred. Not because pain is beautiful in itself, but because pain becomes sacred when it strips away what falsehood kept hidden. Think of a wall that has been painted over again and again to hide the cracks beneath it. Each new layer makes it look solid from a distance, but eventually pressure builds. The structure shifts. The hidden cracks push through the surface. The wall can no longer pretend to be whole. That is what breakage often is. The hidden crack finally becoming visible. And in the divine masculine path, that crack is often the space where truth first begins to breathe. He sees the exhaustion, the grief, the emotional hunger, the fear of being fully seen, the cost of staying defended, the loneliness beneath the performance, the ache of carrying a masculinity that looked strong from the outside but left him inwardly distant from himself. This seeing hurts, but it also liberates, because a man cannot heal what he refuses to name. He cannot awaken from what he still romanticizes. He cannot enter truth while continuing to worship the image that keeps him asleep. So breakage becomes the moment when worship begins to end. He stops worshiping the old story, the story that he is untouched, the story that he needs nothing, the story that he can stay emotionally removed and still experience real intimacy, the story that control equals peace, the story that silence equals wisdom, the story that his pain does not matter as long as he can keep functioning. All of that begins falling apart. And when it falls apart, he may feel like he is losing himself. But what if he is only losing the version of himself that was built to survive, not the one built to awaken? That is the deeper truth. Breakage often feels like death to the ego, because the ego cannot imagine identity beyond the structures it has built. But the soul knows something the ego does not. What is false must become unbearable before what is real can be chosen fully. This is why so many divine masculines need the breaking. Not because they are incapable of insight, but because insight alone is often not enough to undo years of adaptation. They need to feel the cost, feel the strain, feel the lie, feel the emptiness of the old self deeply enough that surrender becomes more possible than performance. And performance always resists this stage. It whispers, hold it together. Get back to normal. Do not let anyone see this. Just push through. Just stay productive. Just move on. Just return to the role. But the soul has begun saying something else. Enough. Enough hiding. Enough carrying the image. Enough pretending control is peace. Enough denying what hurts. Enough feeding the role while starving the self. Enough living as a man who can survive anything except the truth. That enough is holy. It is the beginning of rupture. The beginning of honesty. The beginning of a masculinity that no longer wants to be built on defense. And this is why breakage, painful as it is, becomes the first honest moment. Because honesty often does not begin when a man finally has the perfect language for his healing. It begins when he can no longer keep pretending the old self is working. That moment changes everything. Now he feels the mismatch. Feels it in the body. In the chest. In the silence after the distractions fade. In the strange disinterest toward what once kept him occupied. In the heaviness that comes from living too long at a distance from his own heart. And that heaviness is not meaningless. It is truth pressing upward. Truth about what he misses. Truth about what he fears. Truth about what he has been avoiding. Truth about what he actually longs for. Truth about the kind of man he can no longer remain. This is not easy. But it is clean. Cleaner than the old performance. Cleaner than the old self-protection. Cleaner than the polished version of masculinity that never allowed him to admit where he was broken. Now the fracture is visible. Now the false strength is tired. Now the soul is no longer willing to let the lie pass unquestioned. That is why the breaking comes before awakening. Because awakening needs honesty. And honesty often arrives only when the man can no longer maintain the false version of himself without feeling the violence of it. So if the divine masculine is in breakage, do not always rush to interpret it as destruction. It may be the first time he has stopped trying to outrun his own truth. The first time he has allowed the mask to crack. The first time he has felt the cost of his own self-abandonment clearly enough to stop calling it strength. The first time he has been forced to admit that the old version of him cannot carry the life his soul is asking for. That is not failure. That is revelation. And revelation is the first sacred language of transformation. Because once a man becomes honest enough to say, "This is not working," something new becomes possible. Not immediately. Not perfectly. But truly. Now surrender can begin. Now grief can be felt. Now silence can teach. Now the heart can speak. Now the real man has a chance to emerge from beneath all the years of pressure, performance, and protection. That is chapter 5. Breakage is often the first honest moment of his life, because it is the point where denial no longer feels stronger than truth. The old identity begins cracking, not because his soul is failing, but because his soul is finally refusing to keep living inside what is false. And when that refusal becomes strong enough, awakening is no longer far away. Chapter 6. The Feminine Mirror and the Collapse of False Strength. There are moments in the divine masculine journey when life does not break him through failure alone. Sometimes it breaks him through love, or more precisely, through the kind of connection that does not simply comfort him, but reveals him. This is where the feminine mirror enters. And when it does, false strength begins to collapse. Not because the feminine destroys him. Not because a woman takes his power. Not because love itself is the wound. But because certain connections reach past the image he has built and touch the exact places he has spent years protecting from view. That is what makes the feminine mirror so powerful. It does not create all his pain. It exposes what was already there. The hidden grief. The fear of intimacy. The pride beneath the composure. The control beneath the calm. The longing beneath the detachment. The ache beneath the identity he has spent years trying to maintain. This is why some connections feel so unsettling to the divine masculine. They do not merely make him feel wanted. They make him feel seen. And being seen is one of the deepest desires of the masculine soul. It is also one of its deepest fears. Because to be seen means the mask is no longer enough. The strong one is seen in his tenderness. The composed one is seen in his inner conflict. The distant one is seen in his longing. The controlled one is seen in his fear. The man who learned to survive through self-containment is suddenly brought face to face with the parts of himself that were never truly at peace, only well hidden. That is why this kind of connection can feel both sacred and unbearable. Sacred because it awakens something real. Unbearable because it exposes everything false. Before the feminine mirror, he may still believe in his own performance. Still believe his silence is wisdom. Still believe his distance is maturity. Still believe his control is strength. Still believe he can stay emotionally defended and still experience real love at a safe distance. Then the mirror appears. And suddenly, what once felt stable begins to shake. He feels more, cares more, thinks more, questions more. Not always in ways he can explain. The connection may stir longing he did not know he still carried. It may awaken grief from older wounds. It may reveal how much of his identity has depended on staying ahead of vulnerability. It may confront him with the terrifying possibility that what he truly wants cannot be reached through control. This is where false strength starts collapsing. Because false strength depends on distance. It depends on performance. It depends on emotional management. It depends on not being touched too deeply. But the feminine mirror touches deeply. It does not always do so through words. Sometimes through presence alone. Sometimes through softness. Sometimes through truth. Sometimes through the simple fact that she reflects back to him a version of himself he can no longer comfortably ignore. Not just his beauty, his fracture. Not just his potential, his unfinishedness. Not just the man he wishes to be. The man he still is beneath the surface. And that reflection can humble him more than failure ever could. Because failure threatens achievement. The feminine mirror threatens identity. It shows him where he still runs, where he still hides, where he still performs, where he still tries to control what can only be received through surrender. That is why some divine masculines retreat when the mirror becomes too intense. Not because nothing is happening, often because too much is happening. The old self does not know how to remain calm when the deeper self is being called forward. He may become inconsistent, withdrawn, quieter, more conflicted. Not because the feeling is shallow, but because it has reached beneath the layers he usually uses to stay organized inside himself. This matters, because many people misread this stage. They think the feminine mirror made him confused, made him unstable, made him emotional, made him pull away. But the mirror usually did not create the fracture. It revealed it. That distinction is everything. The connection did not invent his fear of surrender. It exposed it. It did not create his emotional conflict. It brought it to the surface. It did not create his hidden grief. It gave him nowhere to hide from it. This is why the feminine mirror often becomes part of the breaking. Not because she is sent to ruin him, because she is sent, in some cases, to uncover him. She becomes the interruption his old identity cannot easily dismiss. He may try to rationalize it, minimize it, control it, distance himself from it, return to old habits and old distractions. But once something real has pierced the armor never feels as convincing again. That is the deeper consequence. He can still wear the mask, but now he feels the weight of it. He can still act detached, but now he knows what the detachment is costing him. He can still cling to control, but now control feels less like strength and more like fear trying not to drown. This is the collapse of false strength, not public humiliation, inner revelation. A man realizing that what he called power was often only self-protection in a masculine costume. A man realizing that he could appear steady and still be inwardly divided. A man realizing that the feminine did not weaken him by reaching his heart. She revealed how much of him had been living away from it. And this realization hurts. Because once he sees it, he cannot fully go back. Now he knows he is affected. Knows he is not as untouched as he claimed. Knows he wants something deeper than performance. Knows that the old structure trembles in the presence of real intimacy. This is why the mirror can feel like both medicine and fire. Medicine because it awakens truth. Fire because it burns what is false. It burns the identity that says he must always be in control. Burns the belief that needing nothing is strength. Burns the illusion that emotional distance equals freedom. Burns the role of the man who can love only so long as love does not ask anything real of him. And when these illusions start burning, the divine masculine often feels like he is breaking. In a sense, he is. But what is breaking is not his essence. It is the costume around it, the emotional armor, the practiced attachment, the carefully managed self, the false masculine identity built to keep him safe from being fully known. This is why certain feminine connections leave such a deep mark, even when they do not unfold neatly. Because their purpose may not have been ease. Their purpose may have been exposure. exposure of the gap between who he has been and who his soul is asking him to become. That gap becomes impossible to ignore once the mirror has done its work. He may still resist, still retreat, still fight for the old version of control, still struggle to hold the intensity of what has been awakened in him. But the breaking has begun. He now feels the cost of staying false, feels the ache of self-protection, feels the loneliness inside the mask, feels the longing for a masculinity that is not built on distance, but on truth. This is why the feminine mirror is not just romantic in the deeper spiritual sense. It is initiatory. It initiates him into self-confrontation, into humility, into the collapse of the false self's idea of strength, into the painful awareness that love cannot be approached like a problem to solve or an outcome to control. It must be met by a man who is willing to become real. And that willingness does not come easily to the old identity. It comes through breaking, through the realization that he cannot keep calling his defenses sacred, cannot keep worshiping the image of the unshaken man when his soul is being shaken awake, cannot keep pretending that the parts of him exposed by the feminine are weaknesses when, in truth, they are often the doorway to his deeper humanity. This is where the journey turns. He begins to understand that the feminine did not come to destroy his strength. She came to reveal which parts of his strength were false. That is a holy difference, because false strength controls. Real strength remains present. False strength avoids feeling. Real strength can feel without abandoning itself. False strength hides behind certainty. Real strength can stand in the unknown without performing. False strength protects the mask. Real strength allows truth to strip the mask away. That is what the feminine mirror begins teaching him. Not through lectures, through impact, through the kind of impact that lingers in silence, that returns in memory, that unsettles the old life, that makes ordinary distractions feel thinner, that makes the old self harder to fully believe in. And slowly, through this unsettling, a new understanding is born. He stops asking only, "Why did this affect me so deeply?" He begins asking, "What did this reveal in me that I can no longer ignore?" That question marks the beginning of deeper awakening. Because now he is no longer only focused on the connection. He is focused on the truth the connection exposed. His fear, his longing, his avoidance, his tenderness, his hidden need for something more real than the life he had been performing. This is how the feminine mirror participates in the breaking. Not by taking him apart maliciously, by making it impossible for him to keep living untouched by what he feels. And that is precisely why false strength collapses here. It cannot survive long in the presence of truth this intimate. So if you ask why the divine masculine breaks before he awakens, you must understand this chapter. Sometimes he breaks because the feminine mirror reflects back everything his ego built to avoid. His hunger for love, his fear of exposure, his emotional immaturity, his need for control, his deep exhaustion with the mask. And once all of that is visible, the old identity starts losing power. That is chapter 6. The feminine mirror and the collapse of false strength are inseparable in many masculine awakenings. Because the feminine does not destroy the real man. She often reveals the difference between the real man and the armor he has mistaken for himself. And when that difference becomes undeniable, the breaking is no longer random. It becomes revelation. Chapter 7. What breaks first? The identity, not the soul. When the divine masculine begins to break, it can feel like everything is dying. His certainty, his confidence, his emotional control, his old routines, his image of himself, his sense of direction, his ability to keep pretending that the life he built still fits the man he is becoming. And because the experience is so intense, he may believe something terrifying. He may believe that he is losing his soul. But that is rarely what is happening. What breaks first is usually not the soul. It is the identity. This distinction is one of the most important truths in the entire awakening journey. Because if he does not understand this, he will interpret the collapse as total destruction. He will think the pain means he is falling apart beyond repair. He will think the confusion means he is becoming less of himself. He will think the loss of his old stability means that something sacred is leaving him. But often, the deeper truth is the opposite. Something false is leaving. Something real is trying to emerge. That is why identity is what breaks first. The identity built around control. The identity built around performance. The identity built around emotional distance. The identity built around being the strong one, the composed one, the needed one, the successful one, the untouched one, the one who always has it together. That identity may have carried him for years. It may have helped him survive pain, disappointment, uncertainty, and early emotional wounds. It may have made him look powerful. It may have earned him respect. But the soul knows what the ego does not. Survival identity is not the same as truth. And once awakening begins, truth starts pressing against the identity until the identity can no longer hold its shape. This is why the breaking feels so personal. Because identity is intimate. A man does not simply have an identity. He lives through it, organizes his choices through it, builds his relationships through it, derives worth through it, learns how to move, speak, feel, and protect himself through it. So when the identity starts cracking, it feels like the entire structure of self is under threat. That is why the fear is so deep. He asks, if I am not this man I have been performing, then who am I? If I stop being the one who always keeps it together, what remains? If my old strength was partly defense, then what is strength now? If I can no longer rely on the mask, what is underneath it? These are terrifying questions for the ego, but they are sacred questions for the soul. Because the soul is not interested in preserving every structure a man has built. The soul is interested in whether those structures are true. And if they are not, awakening begins dismantling them. Not the soul. The costume. That is why what breaks first is identity. The carefully managed self-image. The masculine script he inherited. The emotional armor he learned to wear. The persona built to avoid being hurt, exposed, or seen in unfinished places. The false confidence that depended on always staying in control. The false peace that depended on avoiding certain feelings. The false maturity that looked calm but was secretly rooted in distance. All of that begins to fracture. And the fracture hurts because identity always feels personal. A man may think, this is me. This is how I survive. This is what makes me valuable. This is what people trust. This is what keeps me safe. So when life begins breaking these things apart, the reaction is not light. It is existential. He feels disoriented, unstable, less certain, less protected, more vulnerable to feelings, truths, and questions he once held at a distance. And because the old identity no longer works the same way, he may mistake this as weakness. But it is not necessarily weakness. It is exposure. Exposure of what was constructed. Exposure of what was borrowed. Exposure of what was never fully him, even if he lived through it for years. This is why the breaking is often so painful before it becomes freeing. Because first, the man must grieve the identity. He must grieve the self he thought he had to be. The role he learned to perform. The armor that once kept him safe. The image that earned him approval. The version of masculinity that helped him function in the world, even if it did not bring him home to his own soul. That grief matters. Because awakening is not just about gaining new consciousness. It is also about mourning the selves that can no longer come with him. The stoic self who called numbness strength. The controlled self who called fear leadership. The emotionally distant self who called self-protection wisdom. The achiever self who believed worth had to be earned constantly. The silent self who learned how to carry pain without ever truly letting it be witnessed. These selves are not evil. They are adaptive. They were built for survival. Built for coping. Built for the conditions he once lived inside. But survival selves are often too narrow to carry a man into awakening. That is the tragedy and the mercy. What once saved him cannot become who he is forever. At some point, life must ask more. Not more performance. Not more success. Not more control. More truth. And truth threatens identity before it liberates the soul. This is why the collapse can feel like spiritual death. Because to the ego, losing identity is death. But to the soul, it is often a return. A return to what has been buried beneath the role. Beneath the armor. Beneath the scripts. Beneath the coping patterns. Beneath the years of learning how to be acceptable before learning how to be real. The soul was never gone. It was covered. An awakening is often the process of uncovering. This is why the soul is not what breaks first. The soul may feel exhausted, muted, distant, buried beneath too much tension and falseness. But it is not what collapses. In many ways, the soul is what keeps calling him through the collapse. Calling him out of the old identity. Calling him away from the false self. Calling him into the unbearable but sacred honesty that the old life no longer fits. The soul is what says, this is not enough anymore. This is not who you really are. This mask cannot carry you further. This armor is costing you too much. This identity may have protected you, but it is now separating you from the life you are meant to inhabit. That voice may be quiet, but once heard deeply enough, it changes everything. Because now the man begins to see the difference between himself and the identity he has worn. That difference is liberation. Not easy liberation. Painful liberation. The kind that requires him to stop calling the mask me. Stop calling the armor my nature. Stop calling the role my soul. Stop calling every defense wisdom. This takes humility. Because identity wants to be worshipped. It wants to be protected. It wants to keep saying, this is just who I am. But awakening introduces a more dangerous sentence. This may not actually be who I am. This may only be who I became in order to survive. That sentence is a doorway. Because once he says it honestly, even inwardly, the whole architecture starts shifting. Now the breaking is no longer random suffering. It becomes sacred dismantling. He begins to see. My control is not my essence. My silence is not my essence. My detachment is not my essence. My role, my image, my performance, my coping patterns. None of these are my essence. They are structures around the essence. And structures can collapse without the essence being destroyed. This is the truth he must learn in Chapter 7. The house may shake. The walls may crack. The roof may fall. But the foundation of the soul is not the same thing as the architecture of identity. One can collapse so the other can finally be reached. That is why the divine masculine often feels so raw in this stage. He is no longer fully identified with the old self, but he has not yet fully embodied the deeper self underneath. So he lives in between, no longer who he was, not yet fully who he will become. That middle ground is sacred, but it can feel unbearable, because the old identity used to give him definition. Now there is space, silence, uncertainty, a strange sense of being unmade. This is where many men panic. They try to rush and rebuild. They try to grab another role, another identity, another mask, perhaps even a more spiritual-looking one. But awakening does not ask for a quicker costume. It asks for truth. And truth often requires a season where he does not know exactly who he is, only who he can no longer keep pretending to be. That season is not empty. It is formative. Because as the false identity breaks, the soul begins getting more air, more room, more access to the man beneath the role. He becomes less interested in appearances, more interested in honesty, less attached to control, more open to surrender, less loyal to performance, more aware of presence, less willing to keep carrying what is false. That is the soul rising through the collapse. Not dramatic, but real. And this is what makes chapter 7 so powerful. The divine masculine does not break because his soul is failing. He breaks because his old identity is no longer strong enough to keep truth buried. That is a very different story. It means the confusion is not proof that his essence is disappearing. It may be proof that the mask is losing power. It means the emotional cracking is not proof that something sacred is dying. It may be proof that something sacred is finally being uncovered. It means the loss of old certainty is not the loss of self. It may be the loss of a false self that was never meant to lead him forever. So if he is in this stage, the most important thing he can remember is this. What is collapsing may be the costume, not the core. What is shaking may be the identity, not the soul. What is dying may be the defense, not the deeper man. That truth can keep him from misreading the whole process. Because if he mistakes identity loss for soul loss, he will fight awakening as if it is death. But if he begins to understand that identity is what breaks first, he can endure the dismantling with a different kind of reverence. He can grieve it, honor it, thank the old self for carrying him this far, and still release it. That is maturity. That is awakening. That is the threshold where the real masculine begins to emerge. Not because the old self was worthless, but because it was incomplete. And incomplete selves cannot carry full truth forever. That is chapter 7. What breaks first is the identity, not the soul. The soul remains beneath the collapse, calling him forward while the false self loses its grip. And once he sees that clearly, the breaking stops being only terror. It becomes the first clean space where the real man can finally begin to breathe. Chapter 8. Why silence, grief, and isolation become sacred teachers. After the breaking begins, the divine masculine often enters a season that feels empty from the outside. The noise fades. The old distractions lose their power. The roles no longer fit the same way. The life that once kept him moving no longer protects him from what is rising within. And suddenly, he is left with what he spent so long avoiding. Silence, grief, isolation. To the unawakened self, these can feel like punishment. Silence feels like abandonment. Grief feels like weakness. Isolation feels like failure, like life has removed him from the world and left him alone with more than he knows how to carry. But in the deeper spiritual journey, these become sacred teachers. Not because they are pleasant, not because they are easy, but because they teach what noise never could. This is where many misunderstand the masculine path again. They think growth always looks active, always visible, always productive, always moving forward in some clear and impressive way. But some of the deepest masculine transformations happen in the unseen places. In the quiet room, in the long drive, in the sleepless night, in the moments after the messages stop, in the season where he can no longer feed himself with stimulation because stimulation no longer reaches the ache. That is where the real reordering begins. Because once the old identity starts breaking, there is often a gap before the new man is formed. And in that gap, silence enters. Not only external silence, internal silence. the kind that follows the collapse of old certainty, the kind that comes when there are no more convincing distractions, the kind that forces a man into direct contact with his own thoughts, memories, wounds, regrets, longings, and unfinished truths. This kind of silence is unbearable at first, because noise had a function. Noise kept him from hearing his own heart too clearly. Noise gave him something to do instead of something to feel. Noise helped him postpone the confrontation with his own inner world. But now, the old appetite for noise is fading, and in its place comes stillness. Stillness that reveals. Stillness that presses. Stillness that asks questions he may not be ready to answer, but can no longer fully ignore. Who am I now? What have I been running from? What is left when I stop performing? What am I grieving beneath all of this? What have I lost? What version of myself is dying here? What part of me is finally trying to live? These are silence questions, and they cannot be answered through speed. This is why silence becomes sacred. Because silence does not flatter the ego. It does not help him maintain appearances. It does not offer instant relief. It brings him into reality. Not polished reality. Raw reality. The reality of what still hurts. The reality of what he misses. The reality of what he avoided. The reality of how tired he has become from carrying an identity that no longer fits. And alongside silence comes grief. Real grief. Not only grief over a person, a relationship, or a particular loss, but grief over identity. Grief over time. Grief over the years spent asleep. Grief over the man he thought he had to be. Grief over the ways he abandoned himself in order to survive. Grief over love he could not yet hold. Grief over tenderness he mistook for danger. Grief over the parts of him that had to stay buried just so the old life could keep functioning. This grief is not small. And because many divine masculines were never taught how holy grief can be, they often resist it at first. They think grief is regression, weakness, a sign they should be moving on faster, healing faster, becoming stronger faster. But grief is not the opposite of strength. Grief is what happens when truth finally reaches the heart. That sentence matters. A man grieves because something mattered. Because something real was touched. Because something false is dying. Because something once hidden is being acknowledged. Grief becomes sacred when it is allowed to reveal what the soul has known all along. This mattered. This cost me. This changed me. This version of me can no longer survive untouched. This path requires mourning before it can become rebirth. That is why grief teaches. It teaches him what was real beneath the performance. It teaches him where love touched him more deeply than he admitted. It teaches him what the old control could never heal. It teaches him the cost of living defended. It teaches him that sorrow is not always an interruption of awakening. It is often part of its cleansing. And then there is isolation. This may be the hardest teacher of all. Because isolation is not merely being alone. It is being alone without the old ways of escaping yourself. He may pull back from the world. Not always because he wants to disappear. Sometimes because he no longer knows how to keep being the old version of himself around other people. He may find that certain environments feel too loud now. Certain relationships too surface level. Certain conversations too shallow. Certain social energies too expensive. So he withdraws. And from the outside, people may call this distance, confusion, or even emotional coldness. But inwardly, isolation may be doing something sacred. It may be separating him from everything that helped him avoid his own becoming. That is a very different kind of aloneness. Because there is a kind of isolation that comes from fear. And there is a kind of isolation that becomes preparation. A wilderness season. A season where there is no applause. No role to hide behind. No audience to perform for. No easy identity to wear. Only the man, the silence, the grief, and whatever truth is trying to rise from beneath the rubble. This is why isolation becomes a teacher. It shows him whether he knows how to stay with himself when no one is validating the process. It shows him what still chases him in quiet. It shows him what thoughts keep returning, what feelings keep surfacing, what memories still ache, what lies still collapse when there is no more noise to support them. Isolation reveals. Silence reveals. Grief reveals. And revelation is what awakening needs. Because the new man is not built in noise. He is formed in the places where there is enough stillness for truth to do its work. A man may not choose this season. He may hate it at first. He may try to rush through it. Try to fill the silence again. Try to numb the grief. Try to escape the loneliness by rebuilding the old habits, the old performance, the old identity. But if the awakening is real, those things stop satisfying him the way they once did. That is the sign. He can still reach for them. But now he feels the hollowness, feels the self-betrayal in it, feels the distance from what is actually happening inside him. So slowly, sometimes reluctantly, he begins learning from the teachers he never wanted. Silence teaches him how loud his old inner life really was. How much of his energy was spent on noise, control, image, and emotional management. How little space he once gave himself to simply be. Grief teaches him what he truly loved, what he truly lost, and what parts of himself were numbed for too long. It softens him where performance had hardened him. It breaks open emotional territories the old self could not enter. Isolation teaches him whether he can remain with himself without abandoning himself. Whether he can stand in the wilderness without turning every discomfort into an emergency. Whether he can let solitude become purification instead of only punishment. These teachers are not sentimental. They do not care about preserving the old identity. They do not rush to comfort the ego. They strip. They expose. They wait. And that waiting is part of the formation. Because the divine masculine often wants immediate clarity, immediate meaning, immediate proof that the pain is doing something, immediate evidence that the breaking is leading somewhere sacred. But these teachers rarely work that way. Silence does not always explain itself. Grief does not follow a schedule. Isolation does not hand him a map. They require trust, not blind trust. Earn trust. The kind that begins when a man realizes that not everything sacred feels good while it is happening. Some things feel like emptiness before they reveal themselves as preparation. Some things feel like endings before they become initiation. Some things feel like losing life before they become the clearing that makes real life possible. That is what this season often is. A clearing. A dismantling of internal clutter. A removal of false appetites. A sacred stripping down to what is still true when the performance is gone. In silence, he hears the soul more clearly. In grief, he feels the truth more deeply. In isolation, he meets himself more honestly. And through that, something begins to form. A quieter strength. A less reactive presence. A more honest relationship with pain. A less performative masculinity. A deeper ability to sit with uncertainty without becoming ruled by it. This is not glamorous, but it is profound. Because before awakening, he may have believed that strength meant constant motion, constant certainty, constant control. But these teachers begin showing him another kind of strength. The strength to remain. The strength to listen. The strength to feel. The strength to not rush the process. The strength to let what is false fall away without immediately replacing it with another mask. That is the birth of deeper masculinity. Not louder. Tua. This is also why some men emerge from these seasons changed in ways even they struggle to explain. They may speak less, but mean more. They may move more slowly, but with more intention. They may have fewer illusions, fewer unnecessary performances, fewer ways of hiding from themselves. Because silence, grief, and isolation removed so much that was not real. And when the unreal is stripped away, the soul has more room. More room to breathe. More room to lead. More room to shape the life from the inside out instead of merely adapting to it from the outside in. That is the sacred function of these teachers. They do not exist to keep him broken. They exist to keep him honest long enough for the real man to be formed. So if the divine masculine enters silence, do not assume nothing is happening. If he is grieving, do not assume he is simply weak. If he is in isolation, do not assume he is only lost. He may be in the wilderness where the old self dies and the new one is being formed without witnesses. And some of the holiest transformations happen there. That is chapter 8. Silence, grief, and isolation become sacred teachers because they bring the divine masculine into direct contact with what noise, performance, and control could never heal. They teach him how to remain with truth when there is nowhere left to hide. And in that remaining, in that sacred and painful stillness, the real man begins to take shape. Chapter 9. The awakening that follows the breaking. After the breaking, there is often a strange silence. Not the same silence that first felt like loss. Not the same silence that exposed the fracture. Not the same silence that stripped away distraction and left the divine masculine face to face with what he had spent years avoiding. This silence is different. It still carries ache. Still carries uncertainty. Still carries traces of grief, humility, and rawness. But now, something else begins to move beneath it. Something quieter than the old ego. Something steadier than the old performance. Something far less dramatic, but far more real. This is the awakening that follows the breaking. And one of the most important truths about this stage is this. He does not emerge as a new man all at once. He emerges in layers, in moments, in choices, in subtle inner shifts that change the way he relates to truth, pain, love, presence, and himself. This is why awakening after the breaking is so often missed by those looking for dramatic proof. They expect immediate transformation, immediate consistency, immediate clarity, immediate spiritual maturity that can be easily seen, labeled, and understood. But real awakening is often quieter than that. It begins when a man stops trying to restore the false self and starts allowing truth to reorganize him. That is the turning point. Before, he may have been trying to survive the breaking, trying to make sense of the pain, trying to regain control, trying to return to something familiar, trying to rebuild a life that feels stable again. But somewhere in that process, something changes. He stops asking only, "How do I fix this?" and begins asking, "What is this showing me?" That question is the beginning of real awakening. Because now he is no longer only reacting to the collapse. He is listening to it, listening to what it revealed, listening to what it exposed, listening to what parts of him can no longer come forward as leaders in his life, listening to what the soul has been trying to say beneath the noise, beneath the mask, beneath the endless effort to remain strong in ways that were no longer true. And from this listening, something sacred begins to form. Humility. Not humiliation. Humility. The humility to admit that the old way was not enough. The humility to see where fear wore the costume of strength. The humility to recognize how much of his identity was built on protection rather than truth. The humility to stop defending every pattern that once helped him survive. This humility matters because it softens the rigid places in him. The places that used to need certainty, need control, need to stay above the emotional reality of what life was teaching him. Now he becomes more teachable. That is a major sign of awakening. The breaking makes him reachable. reachable by grief, reachable by truth, reachable by love in a different way, reachable by the possibility that life is not just happening to him, but trying to form him. And once he becomes reachable, his masculinity begins to change. Not by disappearing, by deepening. This is the difference between a man who has only broken and a man who is beginning to awaken. The broken man may still be lost in pain. The awakening man begins extracting wisdom from it. He begins seeing where his silence was avoidance, where his control was fear, where his distance was self-protection, where his strength was partly performance, where his longing was pointing toward a deeper truth about what his soul can no longer live without. This seeing does not instantly heal him, but it starts cleaning his inner world. He becomes less interested in defending illusion, less interested in returning to old distractions, less interested in being admired for a version of himself that is no longer real. That is awakening. It is not always loud, but it changes everything. He starts moving differently. Not because someone told him to become spiritual. Not because he wants to look evolved. But because the old movements no longer feel clean. He notices when he wants to react from pride. He notices when fear wants him to retreat. He notices when his nervous system wants control more than truth. He notices when the old mask tries to come back online. And for the first time, he does not blindly obey it. That is profound. Because awakening is not the absence of old patterns. It is the growing ability to witness them without letting them rule. Now he has space. Space between feeling and reaction. Space between fear and action. Space between the old story and the deeper truth. That space is the birthplace of consciousness. And with consciousness comes responsibility. The awakening divine masculine stops romanticizing what is broken in him. He may still carry pain, still feel unfinished, still move slowly through his process. But he stops using pain as an identity, stops letting every wound justify every defense, stops pretending that because he has suffered, he is automatically living in truth. Instead, he begins asking more of himself. More honesty, more accountability, more emotional integrity, more willingness to let his life reflect what his soul has learned. This is where awakening becomes embodiment. He begins to understand that insight alone is not enough. Feeling alone is not enough. Longing alone is not enough. Something must change in how he lives, how he speaks, how he chooses, how he loves, how he responds when fear rises, how he handles silence, how he carries himself when no one is watching. That is when the real masculine begins emerging from the ruins. Not the man who looks impressive, the man who feels internally ordered. This inner order is one of the clearest fruits of awakening. Before, he may have been driven by tension. Now he starts moving from alignment. Before, he may have needed to prove. Now he becomes more interested in being true. Before, he may have called control peace. Now he begins understanding that peace has a different texture. Less tight, less performative, less dependent on how perfectly life obeys him. He becomes quieter in a sacred way. Not shut down, rooted. His energy becomes less scattered. His attention becomes more intentional. His words carry more weight because they are less contaminated by image management. His silence becomes less defensive and more reflective. His strength becomes less aggressive and more stable. This is what awakening looks like after the breaking. Not dramatic perfection. Subtle coherence. And coherence changes how he loves too. He stops approaching intimacy only through control, distance, or emotional management. He begins understanding that love cannot be held cleanly by a man who is at war with himself. So he becomes more aware of his own contradictions, more careful with the impact of his presence, more honest about where he is open and where he is still afraid. This is not easy, but it is real. The awakened man does not become flawless in love. He becomes less unconscious in love. That is a massive shift. He starts noticing when old fears are trying to lead, when withdrawal is about protection, not wisdom, when silence is about avoidance, not peace, when he is tempted to return to familiar patterns simply because they are familiar, not because they are true. This awareness deepens his masculinity, because real masculinity is not built on pretending to be above fear. It is built on facing fear without surrendering leadership to it. That is what the breaking prepared him for. The breaking emptied him of illusion. Now awakening teaches him what can live in its place. Presence, discernment, humility, surrender, emotional depth, cleaner authority, a quieter kind of power that no longer depends on constant proof. That is the man beginning to emerge. And yes, he may still have days where he feels lost. Days where grief returns. Days where the old self still whispers, "Go back." Days where the wilderness feels longer than he expected. But something has changed now. He cannot fully worship the old self anymore. That is the real sign. Even when he stumbles, he knows. Knows the old path costs too much. Knows the old identity cannot carry him where his soul is trying to go. Knows the old masks no longer feel innocent. Knows that once truth has entered deeply enough, pretending becomes painful in a new way. This is why awakening after the breaking is irreversible, even if it is gradual. A man may resist the process, delay parts of it, move through it imperfectly. But once he has seen the fracture honestly, once he has felt the cost of false strength, once he has sat in silence long enough to hear his own soul beneath the performance, something in him can no longer be fully asleep. That is awakening. Not always visible to everyone else, but visible to him. He begins feeling what is aligned and what is not. He begins losing appetite for what keeps him fragmented. He begins wanting a life that feels true, not just one that looks strong. He begins sensing that the real masculine is not the one who never breaks. It is the one who lets the breaking become consecration instead of waste. This is where he starts becoming trustworthy to his own soul. That phrase matters. Because before awakening, he may have been trustworthy to his image, his role, his responsibilities, even to other people in many ways. But he was not always trustworthy to the deeper truth within him. Now that begins changing. Now he starts listening inwardly, honoring what he knows, refusing to keep feeding the structures that made him functional but internally divided. This is how the new man forms. Not through sudden spiritual glamour, through repeated choices toward truth. A choice to stay present. A choice to stop performing strength he no longer believes in. A choice to let grief soften him without defining him. A choice to let humility deepen him without humiliating him. A choice to stop asking life to preserve what the soul needs to outgrow. That is awakening after the breaking. It is not the return of the old self repaired. It is the emergence of a man who has seen through the old self enough that he can no longer live there as home. And this man carries a different quality. Less noise. Less posturing. Less unconsciousness. More truth. More weight. More stillness. More reverence for what pain can teach when it is not wasted. That is why the awakening that follows the breaking is so sacred. Because it proves something the old ego never believed. That collapse was not the end of his masculinity. It was the cleansing of it. That losing the false self did not erase him. It made room for what was real. That the breaking was not evidence that he had no power. It was the moment he stopped mistaking false power for the real thing. This is chapter 9. The awakening that follows the breaking is the slow, sacred emergence of the real man from beneath the identity that could no longer hold him. It begins in humility, deepens through honesty, and becomes visible in quieter strength, cleaner presence, and a masculinity no longer built on control alone. The breaking empties him of illusion. Awakening teaches him how to live from truth. Chapter 10. The Final Truth. He breaks because the real man cannot be born through illusion. In the end, the deepest truth about the divine masculine is not that he was meant to stay unshaken. It is that he was never meant to build his whole life on illusion. That is why he breaks before he awakens. Not because he is weak. Not because he failed some spiritual test. Not because life singled him out for pain. He breaks because the real man cannot be born through illusion. He cannot be born through false strength. He cannot be born through emotional exile. He cannot be born through endless performance. He cannot be born through control dressed up as peace. He cannot be born through a masculinity built only to survive, but never to truly live. Something in that structure has to end. This is the part the ego fears most. Because the ego wants awakening without death, transformation without surrender, love without vulnerability, wisdom without humility, new life without the collapse of the old mask. But that is not how sacred becoming works. A seed does not become a tree by staying closed. A night does not become dawn by refusing darkness. A man does not become real by endlessly protecting the version of himself that helped him survive yesterday. At some point, illusion must fail. And for many divine masculines, that failure feels like breaking. It feels like losing control, losing direction, losing the old image, losing the ability to keep performing certainty, losing the appetite for what once distracted him, losing the false confidence that depended on keeping life emotionally distant. But what if he is not truly losing himself? What if he is losing what never had the right to define him forever? That is the revelation. The breaking is not the end of his power. It is the end of false power. The breaking is not the destruction of his masculinity. It is the purification of it. The breaking is not the death of the soul. It is the death of what kept the soul buried beneath roles, defenses, expectations, and years of adaptation. This is why the journey feels so intense. Because when illusion dies, it does not die politely. It trembles. It bargains. It tries to return. It says, go back to what you know. Go back to control. Go back to distance. Go back to the image. Go back to the performance. Go back to the life that looked strong, even if it left you inwardly divided. But the soul has already tasted too much truth to be fully satisfied with that life again. That is the hidden mercy. Once real awakening begins, the old self may still call out, but it no longer feels like home in the same way. The distractions feel thinner. The mask feels heavier. The old patterns feel more expensive. The false peace no longer feels clean. So he stands at a threshold, not between good and bad, not between being spiritual and being unspiritual, but between illusion and reality, between the man he learned to be and the man his soul is asking him to become. That threshold is holy, because this is where he finally realizes that awakening is not about becoming impressive. It is about becoming true. True enough to stop performing masculinity and start inhabiting it. True enough to stop calling numbness wisdom. True enough to stop calling fear strength. True enough to stop protecting an identity that can no longer carry his becoming. True enough to let the old self fall with gratitude, because it helped him survive, but not let it rule him anymore. This is where the real man begins to rise. Not louder, not harder, not more defended, but more honest, more grounded, more inwardly ordered, more capable of remaining present in truth, more capable of loving without hiding, more capable of carrying pain without turning it into identity, more capable of standing in silence without reaching immediately for distraction. This is the new masculinity awakening inside him. Not a fashionable masculinity, not a performative spiritual masculinity, a real one. A masculinity that knows strength does not require emotional exile. A masculinity that knows leadership begins with self-honesty. A masculinity that knows surrender is not defeat, but alignment. A masculinity that no longer needs to look invincible to feel worthy. A masculinity that has been broken open enough to become compassionate, deep, and clean. And yes, this man will still be human. He may still grieve, still feel fear, still have moments of uncertainty, still move through seasons of silence. But he meets those things differently now. He does not worship them. He does not run from them as quickly. He does not hide behind the same excuses. He does not keep asking illusion to save him from the work of becoming real. That is the difference. Before awakening, he may have lived from reaction. Now he begins living from truth. Before awakening, he may have built his life around staying protected. Now he begins building it around alignment. Before awakening, he may have confused control with peace. Now he begins understanding that peace comes from inner coherence, not outer domination. That is why the breaking was necessary. Because the real man could not be born through illusion. He needed the mask to crack. He needed the silence. He needed the grief. He needed the mirror. He needed the collapse of false strength. He needed the season where life no longer allowed him to pretend the old version of him still worked. Not because suffering is the goal, but because truth was the goal. And truth often enters through the places where illusion can no longer hold. So if you are watching this journey unfold in the divine masculine, do not only look at the breaking and call it failure. Look deeper. The shaking may be revelation. The collapse may be mercy. The silence may be preparation. The grief may be purification. The identity crisis may be the soul's refusal to keep living in a form that no longer fits. And if you are the one walking through this season, hear this clearly. You are not being erased. You are being uncovered. You are not weak because you broke. You are being introduced to the limits of false strength. You are not lost because the old map no longer works. You are being invited into a deeper kind of guidance. You are not behind because the old life is falling apart. You may be closer to truth than ever before. So let the old self fall where it needs to fall. Let the illusion die where it needs to die. Let the silence teach you. Let the grief soften you. Let the mirror reveal you. Let the fire purify what control could never heal. And when you rise, rise as the man who no longer needs the mask. Rise as the man who can feel deeply without abandoning himself. Rise as the man who can stand in truth without needing to dominate. Rise as the man who no longer performs awakening, but carries it. Rise as the man whose strength has been cleaned by humility. Rise as the man whose soul can finally breathe inside the life he is living. Because the greatest truth is not that the divine masculine broke. It is that he broke because the real man was trying to be born. If this message reached you at the right moment, comment below. The real man rises through truth. And if you are walking the path of divine masculine healing, surrender, and spiritual awakening, subscribe to the channel and stay for the next video. Because this is not the end of the breaking. This is the beginning of what is real.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.